Alright, hello everyone. My name is Disc, and in this video we have a viewer submission for a lesson. We are looking at a 19 Neltharus. We are a fortified week, and our willing victim is a Disc Priest named Bubble Sort. And first off, I'm going to try and keep this as quick as possible. So if you're a bystander watching this video, maybe you can just skim through this, take a little bit from it if you would like. Otherwise, I'm just going to mark the start of the key. I think this front section is probably most valuable for bubbles, but I'm not going to dwell on each note or subject. I'm kind of just going to give you my opinion, kind of black and white on these matters. Bubbles, if you have any further questions on these notes that I skimmed through, please just let me know and I can elaborate for you a little bit more. But the start of this video, I think, might have a tendency to drag, and I don't want that to happen. So let's just go through some things really quickly here. I think this will be a great video because you're running Mindbender, which I think is really interesting for our spec. And I think it's really particular, and I think maybe critiquing someone else do it might really highlight some differences between when I do it. So anyway, we are running Mindbender build, and here's a flash of his talents. I have a couple notes here. So I think you should be taking Essence Devourer as Mindbender build. You really just want that right now. I think if you're not going to have Essence Devourer, you should at least take VE, Food for Thought. Also in an Neltharus, so this is a bursting week. You don't need Imp Master spell, so I think you could save this point and maybe put it over into Tithe Evasion for a little bit more defensiveness. And then over on the Disc side of things, this is almost how I would do it as a Mindbender player, but we're missing Castigation here, which I think is a non-negotiable for Mythic Plus. And I would be more inclined to tell you to drop a point from your dot here and put it to Castigation, but also you have, these three defensive points up here, the Bright Pupil, Solace, and Long Schism. I only ever take all three of those if it's a high tyrannical Halls of Infusion. I don't think you need all of those, so one way or another, I think we need to get Castigation lit up. I would say drop Bright Pupil. We'll get there in a second, but when I'm watching your play, I think you're relying way too much on your defensive heals, like Radiance, and not nearly enough on your offensive attacks. And that is just not how Discipline is built. You really want to rely on your offensive attacks. So just food for thought. Let's say you Radiance the group. That is a group-wide heal. If you Mind Blast an enemy, that's also a group-wide heal. So we kind of need to start looking at these as the same thing and rely on the spells in our book that are most useful for the group. So quickly, I want to talk about some UI notes and then we'll move on. I'm going to try and keep this quick. If you have any questions about what I'm saying, I'm happy to go into further detail. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to really try and quickly just hit all these notes and move on. So I think your cast bar might be better suited below your action bars. I know that makes it a little further away from your tune, but I think conversely you can solve that problem by making it bigger. I think you should make your cast bar just about the same size as your action bars. You kind of want those to be more equal, and I think that just gives your eyes a better advantage. Also, when it comes to the space right around and below your tune, I don't really think you ever want to put stuff there. So you need to be able to keep an eye on your surroundings to avoid damage. And putting your cast bar there, one, I think it's too small. Two, I think you could put it in a better location. So if you relocate it and make it bigger, I think that's a very fair compromise. And on the same note, I think your action bars here. So I really, really like to see a lot of my ideas I pitch in my videos. I like to see that you're adopting them. I think that's really, really great. But some of these ideas here are going to be a little bit picky, so take them or leave them. But when it comes to the symmetry, so your action bars here are a little bit whack. They're not quite center. They're not lined up with each other. And I think they're a little bit too big. I'm not really sure how you've scaled these, but perhaps scale them down a little, and then maybe just take the 1 or 2 minutes it requires to line these up, that'll just be better all around. And for the sake of a lesson, it's really nice for me to see your keybinds, but I think generally that's something you might want to hide. When it comes to my action buttons, I really only want to see its icon and its cooldown. So I don't really want to see a keybind. And you also have, I'm not gonna be able to find it quickly, I don't think. Oh, yes I can. So you have a lot of UI elements overlapping. Your tooltip, for one, you have a lot overlapping here with your buttons and etc. I think it's one of those things that takes 20 seconds to fix it and you never have to do it again. I think you should move around some of your UI elements. Try not overlapping things. We really want to conserve screen space here. That is the name of the game with the UI, is every ounce of screen space we can open, the better. And this is something I only recently changed, but I absolutely think it's the right play. So I see you have placed your Mindbender icon center, which is something I used to recommend. And I think it's a fine location, but again, space underneath our toon we would rather keep open. And being that Mindbender has so much synergy with Blast and Death, I've placed my Mindbender right here, and I think that makes it a little bit better. I'll show you an example when we get there in a minute, but you are dropping a lot of your Torment spells, and you're dropping the Torments on the end of the window. So I think what's happening is you get the handful of your starter Torments out of the way, and then your attention is pulled somewhere else. You take your eye off of your Mindbender timer, and you have his Torment spells available while he's still active, and you're just not firing them. So I think if you pull all of these three things together, really kind of like hone your eyes in on one area of the screen, showing you all the spells pertinent to those Torments, I think that just helps. So food for thought. And I recently uploaded a new Radiant Providence weak aura. I think you should get that. The only way you have to track it at the moment is your spell icon will glow. I think bringing up a weak aura is just the right thing to do for it. And then when it comes to bursting, so you have my weak aura that puts a border on a friend or an ally when there's a dispel. I don't think keeping that enabled for bursting is the best idea. So there's a way you can just exclude bursting. Food for thought, I think maybe you should take that off of your dispel tracker. And then in the theme of always trying to conserve screen space, I look at anywhere you can open the screen as worthwhile. And we have a handful of spells here which you don't really need displayed. So this is just some food for thought, but something that doesn't have a cooldown like Fortitude or Enemy Purge or Mass Res, Renew, Flash Heal. These are all spells that you can bind on a bar that's hidden, and it opens up your screen space just a little bit more. But again, my opinion is every ounce that you can open your screen space, the better. Also, just while we're on the subject of Purge and Mass Res, I noticed in your video you don't have those keybound. You're actually just clicking the icons. These are too frequent of spells, and they're spells you need to spam often. It's worthwhile putting a bind on those. And then I saw you downloaded my Innervate weak aura. I think it's titled When Should I Innervate? That is not for the priest, that is for the druid. If you're using it to track the duration of your rapture, I think you can better do that with a bar graphic that kind of just matches vertically next to your frames. And then also, so when it comes to information on your screen, I look at every single number, every single value as just adding clutter. So I already mentioned maybe taking off key binding marks on your spells. I've talked about maybe eliminating some spells on your screen altogether. But when it comes to your tooltip, you really don't ever need that displayed in combat. So there's a weak aura to hide that in combat, and I think that is valuable. And then also, I've never seen this before, but you have your buffs and debuffs underneath your unit frame over here. So we have this new feature, I think it's brand new, but we have this triangle where we can collapse those. It's nice to have a way to see them, but you never really need to see that in combat. So I think maybe you should put those back where they came from and just collapse them. And that would open up, pretty good amount of screen space right there. And again, we're getting picky here, but let me find a different frame where we have an example. Oh my gosh, okay, here we go. So in this frame, your harsh discipline counter, it's going to be overlapping with your penance cooldown, and it would just be in a better position if you clicked it right a little and down a little. My philosophy is I want my UI to read as if it is native, and I try and keep it as native as possible, to be honest. But I try and put this number to match the idea with the Mind Blast. So I put it in the bottom right corner so it kind of matches the native theme. And then this is debatable. So when it comes to Mass Dispel, especially if you're running improved Mass, it's never not there when you need it. So giving it a priority position in your combat HUD, I changed that recently, and I think a more valuable spell to put here is your Fear. And we'll talk about a couple instances in the key where you could be using that better, but it is a much more priority spell to start working into your rotation. And then also, I think you could try my Levitate macro. So we have a couple of points in here where we have fall time, and I saw you levitate yourself to avoid the damage, but then you were fumbling in your buff section to click the aura off. I do think personal levitates are common enough that it's advantageous of you just to bind in a cancel aura levitate, and this macro, which I'll have flashed on the screen, it puts the personal levitate and the cancel aura on the same keybind, which it does look like you've taken my keybind for shift spacebar. I'm guessing what that is. That's what that is. So you can have your cancel aura on the same bind. So you just hit the bind again and it will cancel instead of having to fumble to turn off the aura. And then this also might just be a little bit picky, but your Shadow Covenant is kind of down here off on its own. We often want to play our Schism, Mindbender, and Shadow Covenant together. We kind of need all of those to line up before we can enter our cooldown successfully. You might want to consider putting that up here kind of with the trifecta. It's really important we keep a close eye on those. And having them together, I think, is kind of just the best way to do it. Recently, I've taken my Rhapsody and Nova and put it right above my Schism. Food for thought. And then quickly, let's find a place where we can talk about KUI nameplates. I think you can make a couple of notes to them and find improvement. Maybe we can just do right here. Okay, so first off, I think you have a setting somewhere that changes their name color to their bar color. I think you should disable that. I think all names should be white, and I think just let the bars change color, not the name. And then definitely, this is like an objective thing if you ask me. I think your nameplates need to be a little bit bigger. So the length and the height, make them a little bit bigger. That'll only help you when you're trying to snipe out executes. If they're a little bit bigger, they're a little bit easier to click on. And just very objectively, nameplates are such an important aspect of our play. They deserve a little bit more screen space. So I think you can make those a little bit bigger, and that would be a very easy change. And then there are a couple points in here, I'll point it out when we get there, but you don't have occluded nameplates hidden. So you're seeing nameplates through walls and you're seeing nameplates through floors. There's a checkbox to hide occluded nameplates, and I think you should turn that on. It would just make your UI a little bit more clean. And then definitely we need to see percentages. So I'm all for taking a value off the screen when and where possible, but the percentage is not a value you want to lose. So it's a very important number. I think keep it up on the screen. That is the best thing you can do for your percentages. And then definitely, so you still have, I'm not gonna be able to find it right here. Maybe I can. So you still have the enemy cast spell icon enabled. I think you can turn that off. And it's not because it's like not important, but the real estate left and right of our nameplate is so valuable. We should be using that for more important metrics. So in Neltharus in particular, there are a handful of trash pulls where there's no easy way to track the mob's cooldown timers, but there is a weak aura, which I can share it with you happily, that has a couple of key spells we should be tracking. It will take the cooldown which is essentially invisible to us, and place that icon on the left of the nameplate. And I just think that is a better use of the left side of a nameplate. On the right side of my nameplates, that's where I show party crowd control. And that's just kind of my system. I don't think an icon of a spell flashing at you really adds much to the experience. I think you can use that real estate for something more important. And then this is also picky, but I would say where your mob names and the health bar are slightly overlapping, I would try and have them not overlap. And it's just really picky, but when it comes to a health bar and that value, I really don't want anything obstructing me seeing that rectangle. Even if it's just a couple of pixels across the top, you might want to separate those out and just have it above. Food for thought. And then quickly, details. I really only have like one note here, but when it comes to maximizing PI, one of the metrics that I value is which one of my allies is doing the most damage overall. And although, let's say maybe a mage statistically does better with PI, if our ret paladin is maximizing better and has better gear, that it's just a valuable metric to see who's outperforming in the group. And that is just one metric I use to kind of direct my PI to the best place. So I think having one of these set to damage overall, or possibly even opening up a fifth for damage overall. And then, yeah, while we're down here, I think you can hide your bags. I think pretty much everyone still has bags bound to B, so you don't necessarily need them taking up screen space. And then a quick little caveat talking about keybinds. And I know it's a very subjective topic. I've talked to a lot of people over the years, and something I've recognized is that just everyone does it differently. However, I think when you're approaching key bindings, it's really important to have a goal in mind. So you don't want to just willy-nilly bind things and create like a maze on your keyboard and have your fingers doing like a game of Twister. That's the wrong direction. You really want to develop a keybind system that is easy and flows, and you're conscious of what spells are played in common sequence. And spells like that, you want those to definitely be easily played from one to the next. And I've said it before in my videos, but we have two main categories of input that drive Mythic Plus. We have character positioning, and then we have casting. And those are both equally important and dependent of each other. So my philosophy is whenever you're on a keyboard, there's an element of searching for a key. And even if your finger only has to move one key over, just try and imagine conversely a keybind system where your fingers never have to move to find a key. And that's what we're trying to create here. We want our hands completely at rest. Their only job is to press or release. We want to take the searching out of our system. I look at it as kind of building in a weakness. If you want to maybe think about, let's say you're just typing a sentence, a portion of your key strikes will always be misfires and typos. So if you're having to reposition your fingers, in my opinion, it just builds a weakness into your system. And, being that we have these two entities of movement and positioning, then we have casting separately. The way our brain mechanics work, and I'm not a biologist here, but I'm pretty sure this is how it goes. When we can compartmentalize, so we have two tasks, we have two hemispheres of our brain. If we can compartmentalize those in separate sides, so like left hand, right hand, it gives us biologically an advantage. And it gives, like another point here I'm trying to make is movement is so important, living is so important to time keys. About 100% of your dungeon, you should be pressing Solace, Star, Penance, Mind Blast, Death, etc. 100% of your key, you're pressing those. So in turn, what that means is 100% of your key, you never give your keyboard hand the priority it deserves. You're always taking your hands away from movement to fire a spell. And one thing I am noticing is your actions per minute are quite low in comparison to my own. And I think to a degree what's happening is your fingers are having to make a judgment call. Do I need to move or cast at this moment? you can't do both at the same time because your same fingers are doing both. So I think if you could find a keybind set that kind of divides these two categories, it would be better for you in the long run. And I think there's also an argument to be had. There's no need to fix something that's not broken. I think sometimes to find a new keybind set is not always worth your while. If you're used to this, if you like this, that's an advantage in a sense, but very objectively, if your keyboard hand is having to fight for movement versus casting, and you're always having to search for spells, and you even have a lot of your really common spells here kind of, gate kept behind a combo. So I don't have a single shift, like Shift Q, Shift E. I don't have a single spell bound behind a double activation. It's just harder than one. And one of the advantages of a mouse is I think we both use a 5-button mouse. The advantage of that is those fingers on my mouse hand never have to reposition. There's only one button per finger. The only task is to activate or release. So you can really increase your actions per minute by finding a keybind system where you don't have to translate your fingers between keys. You can keep your hand at rest, have one hand totally prioritizing movement, have one hand totally prioritizing casting, and it is just better in my opinion. And I think you're on the right track. You have your defensive heals coming through the add-on click, which is great, but you have your offensive attacks coming from your keyboard. And this is creating a really bad separation, if you ask me. So the hardest part of discipline is knowing, is now the moment for a defensive heal, or is now the moment for an offensive attack? And the tricky thing about that is both of those can be the same thing, and they yield the same result. But right now you have your attacks and your heals firing differently, and you're very literally creating a division in your mind where you're not seeing those in the same light. So I think if you can put all of your attacks on your mouse to pair up with your click defensive heals, I think it's just a little bit better, and I'm happy to send you my keybind profile if you want to take a look at it. I think if you could adopt maybe even just maybe some more of my keybinds, you'll start finding a more easy experience. And here I wanted to quickly jump over to my game. I wanted to do this more in my individual videos. It just hasn't happened yet, but I think this is a great opportunity to look into my bigwigs and kind of talk about what I've done here, especially in comparison to yours. So I preach it in all my videos, but we really need to whittle down what our bigwigs is telling us. We want as little as possible. So when it comes to these messages, let me open up one of these real quick. When it comes to what we call messages with bigwigs, it's when these spellcasts splash their name on the screen. Even if you're only in 1920 keys, by now, I know you have an understanding of what attacks what pulls have. Seeing their name, I don't think that really adds much, nor do I think you're reading it. And then to take it one step further, if you're pausing in the middle of combat to read all of these messages, I don't think you're focusing on the right things. So we really need to edit this down. I have all of my messages disabled, and I wanted to click through this just one by one real quick. So boss 1 of Neltharus. So these are all gray because I have messages turned off. They're gray when they're only partially on. And the only bar I'm tracking, so they call them bars, the only bar I'm tracking is the grounding spear. This is kind of our cadence to time our Shadow Covenant. The rest of these have no bar, only the sound. So I do think when it comes to monitoring incoming attacks, using your sense of hearing is the best way to do that, just in my opinion. So I don't want multiple bars on in the fight. It could just be my dyslexia, but I think it puts me at a disadvantage. If I'm trying to line my shit up for a grounding spear, I have 5 or 6 bars on, and I first have to decipher which bar is the one for my healing. So what I would rather do is just have one bar enabled and know it's for my healing. And most bosses really only have one that you should have on anyway. And for boss 1, it's the grounding spear, so that's the only one I think you should track with a bar. Let's go to the next one. So again, all of these are partially disabled. All of their sounds are on, they're audibles, but the only bar that's on, is this one. So I would turn all your bars off except Might of the Forge. We know that the Blazing Aegis comes second. It's nice to hear the cast, but we don't. Our heals are being timed around Might of the Forge. So that's your only bar. And then with Magma Tusk, your heals on this one, I saw you have my weak aura for its energy. Your heals revolve around that weak aura bar, but I have a couple of these fully disabled because I just don't think they're that important. And then the gray ones are just the audibles. We have no bar timers here. And then final boss. So again, these are all audibles. The only bar timer I'm tracking is Magma Shield. So I hear all of these. Magma Shield's the only one I see. And we have more to talk about that when we get there. And I'll quickly go down my trash list here in case you wanted to copy mine. But I think more importantly, in going through this bigwigs with you, is this is not a hard process. It does take a couple of minutes per dungeon, but this is something you should do to all of your keys. Honestly, each one would take you probably 3 minutes. We have 8 keys. You could get this done in a blink of an eye, and it really opens your eyes in a sense to what's most important, and we're trying to eliminate everything that's not absolutely necessary. So this is my list for trash. Again, we're only seeing gray checks here, and that's because we're hearing audibles only on the gray. Everything else is turned off. And so I want to make a point here. Dragonbone Axe, it's a really important spell to see. There's a lot of damage you have to recover with this attack. I have it turned off not because it's not important, but because we're tracking it another way. So you do have my weak aura for the targeted casts that'll highlight your party. So this is one of them because let's say Bigwigs were to splash a message at me saying it's going off, or I hear an audible that it's going off. That is not nearly as important as knowing whom is being attacked. That is why, so this is important, but we would rather see where it's going with that weak aura rather than just that it's going off. So that's kind of my philosophy there. Just because it's turned off doesn't mean we're not tracking it somehow. It's just we are not going to track it in Bigwigs. So that is our Bigwigs. Let's go back over to the clip. And so quickly before we move over to the key, I think this is the last thing I want to talk about, and it's spell priorities and rotation. I think this is going to be the biggest area of improvement for you. Your UI is pretty decent. I think we have highlighted a couple tweaks in there, some ideas that might actually help you maximize more. But I think in taking a look at your numbers, we gain a really unique insight into which spells in particular you're not maximizing yet. So these are, this is your list on the left and my list on the right. These are not the same key or same key level, but this is what you should be aiming for by and large with a Mindbender build. So this is our damage profile, and our first 3 match, so we're in good place. But looking at the difference between 3 and 4, we have a huge discrepancy here where everything else almost doubles, 4 through 7. Yours is not that large at all. So what this tells me is we are not playing our DPS spells efficiently. And when we look at the healing meters, I think we'll be able to see that, highlighted over there as well. You're relying more on your direct heals, which is more the playstyle of Holy. We need to rely more on our offensive attacks, which are our heals. So potentially, I think your Mindbender should be number 1, not number 2. Your Holy Nova, that's fine. And then this is where we also see a really big problem when it comes to your rotation and spell priority. Our next 4 spells should be our shadow spells, and it should be our shadow spells because of Shadow Covenant. This is our main driver for HPS and DPS. It kind of does both at the same time, and it's very common for me to see these 4 grouped, mainly because of our Shadow Covenant. And we'll talk about a Shadow Covenant rotation shortly, but the biggest thing I wanted to note here you are not playing your Penance and Dark Reprimand nearly optimally. And I noticed when I was watching your key, it looks like when you're in Shadow Covenant, you almost give no priority to Dark Reprimand. The thing about that spell is within our Shadow Covenant, we can and should be getting 2 large Dark Reprimand procs. So one rule of thumb I live by is I'm really only playing Penance if it's a proc. Maybe I might use it less than a proc just to spread my dot. But if I'm using it less than a proc, I would consider that a mistake. So we need to be using those only when they're procs. And within our within our Shadow Covenant, we need to really fiend for 2 large Dark Reprimand procs, which isn't that hard if you just get in the habit of it and start thinking a little bit differently. But looking at my meters, let's compare my Holy Penance. This is right at 3. My Dark Reprimand is right at 8. So my Dark Reprimand is over double the amount of my Penance. So let's compare that to yours. Your Dark Reprimand isn't even in this top 3, and it's actually below Penance at about half the value. So you're really not playing this optimally enough. It should definitely be way up here. It is a huge spell for us, especially since you're playing Long Schism. These 2 Dark Reprimands I'm referencing will both land on Schism, making them just huge for us. So I think if you start making sure you get 2, this Dark Reprimand number will very easily shoot up. We should have to make sure we get 2. And then also back up here looking at Mind Blast, I think there's almost no reason this should be under Shadow Word Death. Mind Blast can very easily be above Shadow Word Death, and it should be. And as we are learning to maximize this better, your Expiation in turn will kind of rise in tandem. But that was another thing I noticed is your Mind Blasts were often sitting at a 2, which means there's loss. This is kind of the one and only spell in our book that I never allow to sit at a 2. You always want this on cooldown. It is, in many ways, our biggest spell. So let's take a quick look at your HPS. All right, so here we have your HPS, and this is not the same key. This is not the same key level or the same spec, but I still think this is a good example which highlights a really expectable spread when it comes to your spell priorities. So if you look at mine, my Atonement is soaring in first. And no matter what the spec or what the dungeon, it'll kind of always look like this. And the difference between your 1 and 2 is not that great. So we already glanced at your DPS, and we've kind of highlighted that you're not relying on your DPS spells enough. And this image right here kind of just proves the point I'm trying to make, that our Atonement heals and our DPS attacks are our strongest spells. So we need to be playing those more and relying less on our defensive heals like Radiance. And you'll see that's where yours, I would say you're playing it wrong. I think a lot of people get into this rut of where they rely on Radiance because they see it as an upfront heal, in which it is, but it provides our spec a different type of utility. That's just maybe an added bonus, if you ask me. So Radiance is something I'll always play in my Shadow Covenant, or it might be something I play after Shadow Covenant, but you never, if you can, I try not to use it in my ramp portion. So if I'm ramping into Shadow Covenant, I will rely on longer atonements, our regular atonements, and the 4-second difference between a regular atonement and a Radiance atonement is just huge. And again, we've highlighted the importance of our DPS attacks. My philosophy is leading into our DPS window, let's ramp with long atonements so the group is covered for 15 seconds. We can go into our DPS window and have the freedom to just DPS. So the way that works is part of the way through your DPS window, these long atonements will naturally begin to taper off. That is when you work in 1 global for a Radiance and you just keep DPSing. So this is a rut I see a lot of people fall into, and I think you've definitely fallen into that rut. There are many instances in here where we have really predictable damage that relies on Shadow Covenant. There's no reason these attacks, which are spread apart by like 40 seconds, There's no reason you can't prepare better for those with long atonements. And I really think it just sets your Shadow Covenant up for more success. The value of a longer atonement is just huge in my book. And we really want to set ourselves up in a position where we're allowed and have the freedom to just DPS. That is the strength of our spec. And then here's a big one too. Look where my flash heal is. It's actually above my radiance. Your flash heal is not even on the meters. So flash heal is a huge driver for us. There are a lot of cases where we want to flash heal, maybe if we're doing an atonement ramp. So the nature of a flash heal, the atonement's backloaded. A renew, the atonement is front loaded. You can put those two spells together and get more out of your atonements. It'll make them the same duration. So we want to use it strategically a lot of times. And then there are a lot of scenarios as well where we just want to buy a little bit of time. So we're trying to delay and hold off on Shadow Covenant. We can fill that time with Flash Heal. I really just don't think you're using it enough. It is a huge play in our book. You know, we have instant Flash Heals as well. It's something you need to just use more of in place of Radiance. And then also, just while we're on the subject of Radiance, you're not really maximizing that yet. And I see this, I've seen it a lot, and I don't know where it comes from, but a lot of Disc Priests, for some reason, are using @player Radiance, which is a horrible idea. It's not going to give you even the remote chance of maximizing that spell. And I think that might be where someone reaches if they're newer to the spec. But I think you're at the place where you're playing, 19, 20, 21s. You need to take those training wheels off. You need to put your Radiance into your click casting and direct that to the best person in a pull. And that might be a little bit harder, but it only gets better with practice. And I think now's the time for you to start changing up your habits there. So compared to the rest of our spell book, which is a 40-yard range, a Radiance is only a 30-yard range. So in other words, it is very, very likely if you're casting it randomly or only casting it on yourself, it's very likely you're going to miss members of your party, which we see all throughout this dungeon, is you'll cast a Radiance and some of them only hit you and one other person. So we need to get away from this @player Radiance. We need to look into the field at our party nameplates, which you have on. Find who's in the middle of the group. And if you're trying to play Radiance optimally, that's where you need to direct your Radiance. So this @player Radiance is a horrible idea. Build that into your click and work on getting that spell maximized more. So always radiancing yourself is not a good idea. Always radiancing the tank, that's not even a good idea. Usually the best person is sometimes a DPS, and it varies pull to pull. Always casting it on yourself will never give you the chance to maximize that spell. Okay, so now that we have highlighted some of the spells and areas where you might not be maximizing your spellbook, and I think we've also kind of highlighted an area where you're relying too much of on defensive heals rather than relying on your attacks, I think a really important thing for you would be, let's just focus on your Shadow Covenant rotation for a moment, which was, to be honest, quite whack. So I think if we can iron out your Shadow Covenant Mindbender rotation, it'll solve a lot of problems all at once. So this is our healing cooldown, but we pump those heals by DPS. So this is honestly, it's all the HPS we need. It's just the hard part of it is we get our HPS through a sequence of, like a really nasty sequence of 20 spells. So it's all the healing we need, but we need to get a certain amount of DPS attacks to yield that same amount of output. So when it comes to playing Mindbender, it's a little bit different than a standard Shadow Covenant window. We need to consider what spells we can get multiples of in our window, and those are our Dark Reprimand. I've already said we need to pretty much always get 2 large procs of this. And then baseline in Mindbender, we can always get 4 Mind Blasts. If we have PI and Lust, very easy to get a 5th. And when it comes to Shadow Word Death, we can always get 2, and with execute ranges, we can get up to 4. So the way I look at Torments it's really important for you to check yourself and kind of count them and see where you're missing value. But if you're getting 9 torments, you're fully optimal. That's all of your executes plus a haste window. Getting 8 is a little bit more rare, but still more common than 9. It's where we're getting all 4 executes and we get all 4 mind blasts. And then a much more common baseline is to hit 7 torments. And that's where we have all mind blasts, but only 1 execute reset of death. And then I would say if you're getting like 6 or under, you're missing value, or maybe you're just on a boss fight. But I would say you need to aim for 7 optimally, 8 if you're lucky, and 9 if you're extra lucky. So something to think about here is our blast and death are what synergize with our mindbender. So we don't want to rule out the value of our Dark Reprimand, and we always want to aim for those 2, but since it has no synergy with mindbender, we want to put one of those 2 in front of the mindbender. So one thing I was noticing in your rotation is you're getting your upfront torments just fine, but let's say over here where your mindbender's tailing off, you're missing those. And some of them I think you just missed, but I think some of them you ran out of time. And if you have 2 Dark Reprimands in your window, it's just giving more button bloat and taking time away from the more valuable torment spells. So this is the best rotation for a mindbender. We want to lead in with a full proc. So this should be glowing as a proc. Schism, Shadow Covenant, drop our proc, then our mindbender. So now we have this trifecta of spells here that we need to play together. By putting mindbender last, we're giving it most priority. And we've taken the Dark Reprimand out, kind of alleviating some of the button bloat. We'll give you the best opportunity to get all of your torment spells. And again, you need to start kind of checking yourself and counting them. But you'll see here, I've moved my pet icon over to the blast and death. I think that really helps keep your eye on those 3 values. So I'm always really closely watching the second counter of my pet. And having all of these values together, I think just helps you maximize it a little bit better. And then something you could also do, I thought your mindbender icon was a little small. I think I have mine here increased to like 120%. You might want to increase that a little bit. But then, so once we get past our opener, I think things just kind of fall into place naturally. You want to really prioritize and fiend for these mind blasts. Those are the easiest to get. I think your second Dark Reprimand is maybe easiest to drop, so it's really important you get that as well. And then your death, you really have to play that early in your rotation. So it's a 10-second cooldown, which is kind of long, but it's short enough where we get multiples in our rotation if you play it early. So Mind Blast is our most important. We want to play it first. We want to play Death second, so that it gets on cooldown and we get its multiple. Then the rest kind of fall into place naturally. You want to do some redots in here. Midway through your Mindbenders where you work in your Radiance. We need Solace for our Harsh Discipline counter. And then Star is one of those abilities where if it's an AoE pull, I prioritize it. If it's a single target pull, I don't prioritize it as much. And when it comes to your Rhapsody and Holy Nova, this window is very finite and very bloated as it is. You can work it onto your Schism if you would like, but I think it is better just to pull that spell in front of our window, get it out of the way, get it resetting, take it out of the window, leaving priority to our Torment spells, and I think that's just the better way to do it. So that is it for rotation. I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, we can go over that more in detail, but I think this will, if you work on this one cooldown, Shadow Covenant, I think if we can get this much more accurate, you're going to solve a lot of problems all at once. We're going to get higher activity time. Your spell priorities will kind of work themselves out. You'll get more damage, you'll get more healing, and I think you'll really find a better rhythm for this spec. Because right now, relying on Radiance is not how the spec is meant to be played, and you're putting yourself in a position where you're going to be fumbling. So again, we're only using Penance when it's procced. unless maybe situationally you're trying to spread your dot. We want 0 at player radiance. You need to stop doing that probably sooner rather than later. We need more flash heals. We need more torments. And this is user's choice, but I think you should try an at cursor mass dispel macro. So there were a couple times I think you just messed up and we had a 15 stat go out in the group and you were too late to cast and you had deaths. But I think in one of those cases, you pulled up your large green AoE circle, and before you were able to cast your spell, you died. So the beauty of an at cursor macro is when that green circle came up and you died, it would have already been casting. So it makes things a little bit quicker, and it's hard to say if an at cursor would have saved any lives, but it might have. Some people look at it as a disadvantage to use at cursor, but I really don't ever have any problems with that, and I think it just speeds things up quite a bit. And then just food for thought when it comes to Mindbender, you're not quite farming his cooldown back efficiently. And again, this comes from you're not playing your DPS spells enough, you're relying on the wrong spells in your book, you're losing a lot of value and synergy, and you're not farming his cooldown back efficiently. So when it comes to Shadow Covenant, that is a hard 30-second cooldown. The mechanics of our Mindbender is we should be able to have our Mindbender line up with all of our Shadow Covenants. So if your Shadow Covenant is coming available and your Mindbender is not close to coming available with it, you're kind of you're not going to be taking advantage of him the best. You really want those to pair up. You want to farm his seconds off to pair and match with Shadow Covenant. So I look at Mindbender as a 30-second cooldown if you're doing it right, and Shadow Covenant's also a 30-second cooldown. We need to have those line up and match the best we can, and you're only going to do that by switching your spell priorities over to your damaging spells. So I think that's all I wanted to say for an intro. Let's go ahead and clip over to your key. All right, so here we go. I think I really like this structure for a lesson video where we spend the front of it, it's mainly for bubbles, but I'm sure some people are going to listen along. It's highlighting everything that I'm saying I'm looking for. We've talked about talents. We've talked about misses in your rotation. We've talked about relying too much on defensive heals. So now that you know exactly what I'm looking for, and now that we've highlighted areas where you're not maximizing, we can keep those in mind and watch this key from a third party. Is that what that is? Third party? First person? Third person? But I think it gives us the advantage to where now you kind of are primed for what I'm about to say. And now we're just going to go through this video and I'm going to point these areas out. So I think one thing I'm going to try and do is we're going to count your torments each window, and then we're going to see how well you're maximizing those. So for PI, I might aim for Mage or Paladin, honestly any of them. So I also think I remember in this area, this is the perfect place for Rapture. I'm not sure you played Rapture. Also looks like you could have faded by now. Fade is really amazing here as well. Takes yourself off the aggro. That needs to be your favorite button. Okay, so we reached for Barrier. Okay, so that is definitely one area where if your Mass Dispel fired instantly without that green area of effect aspect, you probably would have saved a life. I think he was actually out of your range. I don't know, but I would say you were pretty late on that one. I would have tried to precast it a little sooner. And also Rapture was not played, so if this were my run, even if I were playing Mindbender, that would have been my Rapture for Shizzle. But use both pain subs. So at a moment like this, all pain subs are down. We really need to play Rapture because that is a great way to farm back our cooldown. Let's see how you do this one. We're getting dots out. And we go straight into Mindbender. That is fine. Except you did not have your Harsh Discipline propped. So as we know, we really must aim to get 2 large Harsh Discipline procs. And you might have to watch it back to see, but another thing I would not have done is your Mindbender was out and you broke from his rotation to go into Rapture when you had Torment spells left. So, and I didn't count your Torments, but we'll do that next. Try to. Also, glancing at your nameplates right now, it looks like you have no dots out. That is never a position you want to be in. It's actually quite the opposite. You always want all dots out, if you can. Okay, and right here, this was a questionable Mindbender. You know, I suppose not a problem. But what happened is it looks like you had this really nice long buffed Schism out, and you accidentally were not attacking your Schism. So that's quite advanced. If you have questions about that, we can talk about it off the books. But using focus macros with your Schism is the best way to maximize that spell. Okay, and right there I just noticed you penanced one of those mobs that was dry. You pretty much, if you can help it, you never want to penance a mob without a dot. It is just huge value to get that spread. Huge. Okay, so we have this pull. What goes on? Yep, we see those messages popping up on the screen. I don't want to talk about those too much either, but the problem I have with those messages is they're overlapping your nameplates. And I really don't want anything obstructing my view of my nameplates, especially not these messages that, like, you're just not reading. You got lucky with that at player radiance. That actually hit all of you. Okay, so I think in a fight like this, we can more easily count your torments. So let's see how that goes. I'm pretty sure the way you play this, I'm drawing a blank right now, but you want to delay your Shadow Covenant Mindbender until the mutation. And this front end, you just want to pump some natural DPS. Okay, see, yeah, you ran your Shadow Covenant on pull. So at this level of key, not a problem. But honestly, if your goal is to push into higher level keys, practicing it that way is more advantageous for you to do now. Gosh, I wasn't able to count your torments either. Yeah, so you can probably get through this damage even without Shadow Covenant, but it's not a bad idea to hold your Shadow Covenant for that window. Some people might fight me on that choice because you have about 15 to 20 seconds of downtime, but I think that's how you gotta do it. Schism, Mindbender. How many torments you get. So you have your proc. You're not playing it. And right there's a perfect example of your Radiance not hitting the full party, your at-player Radiance. And then you could have had a double death there. So you missed 3 torments, and you gave no priority to your Dark Reprimand. I think maybe you just missed your Dark Reprimand, like you didn't see it or something. But if you don't know this, I want to emphasize it right now, that your Dark Reprimands need to take more priority. You need to get 2 of them, and the only way you're going to do that is if you play it at the front of your cooldown window. Yeah, so that's where you manually clicked off that aura. So try my Levitate macro, and you can put your Cancel Aura Levitate on the same keybind. It's Hello Pro. Okay, so we have another run for the weapons. This is another place where I would have my finger hovering on Rapture. Not a bad idea either, as the tank is leading into a pole and about to run away from you. Go ahead and have him atoned. I would also be literally just flooding atonements while we position. We need everyone atoned right now. And also right here is where I'd be rapturing. Yep, there's that green AoE. You probably still would have died, but an at cursor would be quicker. Another reason I might play Rapture there as well is when I'm in these pulls, I'm like, what I'm thinking literally is, oh shit, we're about to have a 20 stack of bursting. So I'm completely like primed and like hovering on that button. But something like Rapture here would have done a lot of good to keep people's health at full, which makes them easier, like more tanky with that bursting. That makes sense. All right, so with this boss, we have a handful of things that we can talk about. First off, I believe you're tracking way too many bar timers with bigwigs. I would turn all of these off except Grounding Spear. That is the only thing we need to keep an eye on for our Shadow Covenant. And right there, that was a really nice free shield. And I think this use of Rapture is okay as well. Covers the upfront damage of this Grounding Spear that's about to go out. And this is where we want to time our spells. Eek. So that was a Harsh Discipline proc on your Dark Reprimand. Your full group was atoned, but you sent it as a defensive penance into, I think it was the mage. So we really needed that Dark Reprimand to get the atonement value off of the boss. I know your ally sank low a little bit, but I really think the right call there would have been to hit the boss. And then I think your next Grounding Spear is not quite as good. So yep, you pain supped yourself a little trigger happy with that. I think a personal shield would have been enough. And right here, I wouldn't have gotten into Shadow Covenant yet. You don't have any atonements out. You went into your Shadow Covenant and then a Radiance. So these Grounding Spears are predictable enough that, you know, after the front end damage of the spear went out, you should have been recovering a little health in the group just with some flash heals. Then you would have had all the atonements you needed to go into your Shadow Covenant prepared. And then also on the end there, you had the opportunity for like 7 torments, but I think you're really only getting like 4. So you're really not getting the value there. Whenever the Mindbender's out, that's all I'm looking at and all I'm thinking about. Getting those torments. So another great place I might use Rapture. Also anticipating a ton of group-wide damage. One idea is possibly, yeah, you could have delayed the barrier because it really didn't get as much value as it could have. Yeah, and right there's an example where you're losing a lot of actions per minute. There's no health in the group, and you almost didn't cast anything for like 5 or 6 seconds. And right here you do devolve into flash healing, which is great. But instead of flash healing yourself there, I would have just been flash healing the others, especially giving one to the tank since he's not atoned. And then you'd be taking more advantage of your binding heals, more HPS. So Radiance is your friend, but so is Flash Heal. We need to give a lot more love to Flash Heal and work that into our rotation more. It's something you want to do before Mindbender is out. Yeah, especially on that last boss, the damage is so predictable and spread out, and also that damage phase can take, 15 to 20 seconds. We want to use the utility of our long atonements especially since it's a scenario where we can easily pre-plan. So we want the group fully atoned with long atonements. We delay our Shadow Covenant and get the full coverage. Okay, so let me see if I can watch your Mindbender here. Counting your torments. 1, 2, 3. And this is where I can see some mobs through the floor. You have your 4th, you're sitting on your 4th and 5th. And 6th. So you dropped 3 torments there, and I wasn't watching the nameplates or like much of what was going on. I was just watching your buttons. But I think what's happening is you send your Mindbender out, and you're not giving him your focus. So what happens is you're looking at the nameplates, you're healing your allies, you're doing other things that are valid, but you're missing torments because you're not focusing on him. And that was a dry penance where you sacrifice the spread of your dot. You definitely want to try and avoid that. And in this group, just from a mechanic standpoint, we can also see the nameplates through the floor. This is where I was talking about the occluded nameplates. But you need to be in melee with these guys. They have a mechanic that they charge people not in melee. And this is also a great pull to offer your fear to stop those attacks, along with any of the weapon pulls. Great for your fear. I'd be throwing out some single atonements here. Single atonements are amazing. They give you a great advantage, and it's almost like you're avoiding them because you think casting something is like disadvantaging you, or I don't know what I'm saying. But you're like really only hitting radiance. And I'm not seeing you. Well, we have some singles here. See how it goes. Opening with Rapture, that's fine. This is a group where I was talking about watching the cooldown of that AoE attack on their nameplate. We need to get you that weak R so you can see this AoE attack. Let's count your torments. 1, 2. That was an early radiance, you could have delayed it. 3 torments. Your 4th is available. You have 2 torments, 2 torments. Okay, so you got a double execute, so that was really great. But you were sitting on 2 Mind Blasts. So that is definitely one area to highlight. You're holding back on those Mind Blasts. That's your most important spell to fiend for. And that, you penanced a dry mob, so we really could have used the benefit of that spread right here. And I also don't think we've seen 2 Dark Reprimands in one of your windows yet. Okay, so that, you had a Dark Reprimand proc. You're in a good place for your window, but you dropped it before you went into Shadow Covenant, and you forfeited that value. So let's see how your torments do here. You have Mind Blast and Death, and you're casting Smite. So you got your double execute, which is great, but you forfeited your torments from Mind Blast, and you had the opportunity, but you were casting Smite. Yeah, so I'm seeing what happens a lot is when our Mindbender's out, we have like a job to do. It's a very finite window. You go into Mindbender and then Radiance. So sometimes you have to. I think that's a very valid place sometimes. But more times than not, you don't want to fill your window with heals. You really have to fill your window with attack spells. And we do have to have 1 Radiance, but it's best when we can put it at the tail end of the window. And that's because very intentionally we want to Radiance late so that those atonements extend beyond the Shadow Covenant. We're essentially like trying to create a larger cooldown window. So if you go into Shadow Covenant and Radiance right on the very top, your atonements and your Shadow Covenant are going to end at the same time. And you have this like abrupt like halt in output. Not good. Okay, so this is one spot where we really need to have a 3. Okay, it looks like you did that. I'm going to assume you did that on purpose. And our first spell here needs to be Shadow Covenant. Yeah, you should have already been in Shadow Covenant. So you chose Rapture instead. I think Shadow Covenant is more valuable. A better choice to put on cooldown first. So the way that boss would go for me is literally right on pull, I Schism. I'll have the group pre-atoned, harsh discipline of 3, right on pole, schism. Yeah, I wish I could have counted those torments. Also, right here, anticipating that AoE in the group, I would have had the longer atonements out. Let's see what happens here. Oh, you re-atoned. Okay. You have your schism. Mindbender. 1, 2, 3. You have Mind Blast. 2 Mind Blasts. Okay, you lost quite a bit of value there with your torments. And I hope in hindsight, you know, when you can watch this back from a third person perspective, I hope you can see that there are all these Mind Blasts you're sitting on. Again, in many ways, it is your most valuable spell. You never want it sitting at a 2. You always want it rolling, especially when your Mindbender is out. And I think most of your torments you're missing are the easiest ones to get. So, you know, arguably the deaths, those are the hard ones to get. Your Mind Blasts are the easiest ones. All right, so let's count. That was 1, 2. We have a Mind Blast. There was 3 torments. We have another Mind Blast, another death. And we only got 3 torments out of 8. So the way it goes with these torments is each one will extend the duration of your Mindbender. And there's a threshold where when you get enough torments, he's out long enough and it opens up the window for you to get another Mind Blast off of cooldown. So if you're not hitting this base threshold, you have no opportunity to maximize the window. And right there, I could argue 7 was your base value you should have gotten, and you only got 3. So when your Mindbender's out, you only have one job, and it's fiending for those 2 torment spells, and that's all you got to do. Okay, with these guys, so a group of 3, you manually dotted each one, but the way a penance works is you dot 1, penance it, and it'll spread to the other 2. So you wasted time dotting all 3. What I would have done is chosen the bird, dotted the bird, manually atoned the group, and at that same time is when he blows up. So you enter into your Shadow Covenant, you penance the bird, and it fills in your dots. And the bird's attack is another one you should track on your nameplates. Okay. I know I have one of these guys as the darker, but I think in these pulls, yeah, that's what you did. I don't know. I think targeting the lava guy might be better because of his mechanics. So here's an example where your Shadow Covenant just came off cooldown and your Mindbender is 10 seconds late. So that's a gap you kind of want to start trying to like keep an eye on and close. That is one reason I suggested bring your Shadow Covenant up next to your Mindbender, is because the goal with those is to have those come off cooldown together. Okay, let me see if I can closely pay attention to your torments here. Yeah, so I don't think Radiance is ever a good opener. So my first play is I would Fiend for a proc. Alright, let's count. So we have 1, 2. Our next Mind Blast is available. There it goes. Our next Mind Blast is available, but it looks like you're prioritizing Smite, and we lose our final torments. So there was an example where if I watch that back again, I think you literally weren't casting anything. So when I talk about actions per minute, we never want a moment where we're not casting anything. And in that moment, with the Mindbender out and Death and Blast available, you needed to be fapping those keybinds to get those within your timer. Okay, boss. Let's see how this goes. I only track the Molten Core. I think that's what it's called. All the other spells that are important to see, you should be able to see those on your bars, and that's the advantage of my setup. So also I remember I'd get a weak aura that names which special weapon you pick up. It's hard for me to remember which one's which, so I name one by, like, melee range, or ranged single target, or ranged AoE. And I think you made a mistake. So you picked this one up. I have no idea what that bouquet does. I know from watching your video, it's the short range attack. And I think this is where we have one problem. Yeah, you weren't anywhere. It didn't land. I think you might have thought it was the long range one. But also you died and you just stood and stuff, so I think you know why. But another concept, and I've talked about it earlier in this video with other things, that is one of those spells which we need to precast. So if you want to think about what's the best way to use that spell, and we want it to land right after the boss's successful cast, and we can, with some practice, we can have those line up almost instantly with a precast, and it kind of just mitigates that phase the quickest. And right here, it does not look like we even have a weapon. Also, like, seeing the weapons, like whatever add-on that was, I don't think that's necessary, especially not on top of your bars. You do not want that kind of overlap. And there we go. So I think you're really on a good track here. I think taking a lot of my UI elements is really going to set you up for success. I think the biggest thing you need to work on, though, is your rotation. I think if you start on a dummy practicing your Shadow Covenant rotation, aiming for all of those spell minimums, I think that will solve a lot of your problems all at once. So anyway, Bubbles, thanks again and good luck. Work on your Shadow Covenant, and if you have any specific questions for me, just let me know, and I can answer them for you. So yeah, thanks again everyone for watching my videos, and if you're interested in taking a lesson with me, please reach out. In the meantime, I am doing lessons on YouTube until I get verified on metafy.gg, so I'm still looking for vouchers over there if you wouldn't mind helping me out. I also have a Patreon if you're interested, and until next time, Disc.